first reading poses the question, is the Lord in our midst or not? And that's a basic question for Lent. Where do we find God? Where do we encounter God? Father Dominic, in the beginning of Lent, told us that our Lenten practices should include prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. We're now in the third week of Lent. How are we doing with our Lenten practices? All of those practices are designed to deepen our encounter with God, to deepen our relationship with Him. So where do we find God? The comedian Louis C.K. has this routine about atheism. And he says, I don't understand atheists. I don't understand how you can say you know that God doesn't exist. I can see you can question Him, whether He exists or not, but how do you know that He doesn't exist? So I said to one of my friends who was an atheist, I said, how do you know God doesn't exist? And he said, well, I've never seen Him. And Louis' response was, well, have you looked everywhere? Have you checked downstairs? Have you looked in the living room? Have you checked the closet? So it's a basic question. Where do we look for God? Where do we find God? In today's gospel, we have a very interesting encounter. Jesus is very tired. He's in a foreign land about noon. His disciples are off looking for food, and he's thirsty. But he's in the Samaritan land, an enemy land for the Jewish people. And then a Samaritan woman comes along to draw water. And there's a couple questions we have to ask. Why is she there by herself? Most Samaritan women would come as a group to gather their water. And why is she coming at noon? Most women would come early in the morning to have their water for the day. So is she an outcast? We're not sure. But Jesus asks her for a drink of water. And her response is she's surprised. She says, how can you, a Jew, ask me, a Samaritan woman, for a drink? So Jesus immediately has broken two taboos. First of all, he's talking to a Samaritan woman, which Jews are not supposed to do. And secondly, he's speaking to a woman. So Jesus enters into dialogue with her, and he offers her living water. In the first reading, we're given real water, and Jacob's well is there with real water, but Jesus offers her living water. And the woman's not really convinced. She's rather skeptical at first. She says to him, you don't even have a bucket, and are you greater than Jacob? He then tells her that his living water that he has is really eternal life. And the woman still doesn't get the idea. She still doesn't understand, but she's very practical. So she's at least going to accept it, possibility. She says, give me this water so I might not be thirsty again, and I won't have to keep coming to this well to get this water. But then Jesus changes the focus of the conversation, and he asks her the question, or tells her, call your husband. And she responds, I have no husband. And he, of course, points out to her that she's had 5, and the man she's living with now is not her husband. I really like the way Father Dominic recited that part, because it's not a judgment. He's very concerned about her. But is that the reason she's an outcast? She's in this unacceptable living circumstance. And at this point, the woman begins to change, and she begins to understand a little bit about who Jesus is. She says, sir, you obviously are a prophet. And then they begin to engage in what we could call a theological discussion. And Jesus ultimately tells her about what true worship is. You will worship the Father in spirit and truth. And she says, I know the Messiah is coming. And at this point, Jesus does something he does rarely in the Gospels. He reveals himself as the Messiah. He says, I am he, the one who is speaking to you. If you remember last week in the Transfiguration, after the Transfiguration, what did Jesus say to the apostles who were with him? Go and tell no one. You notice in this circumstance, he reveals himself as the Messiah, but he doesn't give that injunction. He doesn't tell this woman, don't go and tell them. So at this moment, we get a bit of comic relief. The disciples come back, and they're amazed that he's talking to a Samaritan woman. And then we get this situation where the apostles, as usual, don't quite get what's going on. They're amazed, but they don't ask any questions. And then they say, Jesus must be hungry, so they offer him food, and he tells them, I already have food. And my favorite comment of the disciples is, could someone have brought him food? You know, they really don't understand what's going on. And Jesus tells them, the way he told the Samaritan woman, my food is to do the will of the one who sent me. And then he tells them he's going to send them out, and they are going to reap the harvest that has been prepared for them. But in the meantime, the woman has gone about to proclaim the good news. And you notice that she leaves her jar. The reason she originally came to the well was to draw water. After meeting Jesus, she forgets about what she was doing, and she rushes back to the town. And I think it's kind of interesting in Women's History Month that we have what some commentators call the first missionary, is this woman who goes back to spread the news about Jesus, the Messiah. Her life is forever changed. Yesterday, I had a friend of mine who has a child with autism sent me a letter about a mother who experienced the change that she has gone through because of raising a child with autism. And what struck me in her description was it fits very well with the description of the Samaritan woman. This is what she wrote. She said, "The thing is, once in a lifetime, you get a chance to meet a person who is unlike any other person you have ever met. A person who is complicated and honest and tenacious and pure. The person changes who you thought you were and who you plan to become." I think this is a good description of what happens to the Samaritan woman. She changes dramatically from what she thought she was and what she was about. She answers the question, where do we encounter God? How do we respond to that encounter, and do we allow ourselves to be changed by that encounter? The Samaritan woman expected nothing more that day than to go to the well and draw water. But she unexpectedly encounters Jesus, and her whole life is changed. She's no longer an outcast. She's no longer defined by her sin. The people now listen to her. The man told me everything I had done, and the people come to believe in Jesus because of what she tells them. She is now moved to the center. Where do we encounter God? Are we open to unexpected meetings? Are we open to encounters that will change our lives? There was a TV show a few years ago that wasn't the greatest show in the world, but it was called Joan of Arcadia. And in it, the character Joan constantly meets Jesus in different forms throughout the course of the episodes. And in one episode, there is a janitor who is Jesus or God, and he encounters Joan, and Joan says to him, I'm not really buying this fact that you say you're God. Show me a miracle. And so the janitor points to a tree. She says, "That's a tree." And the janitor says, "You try to make one." So we all like to have planned lives. We want to go to school, get a job, raise our family. But we are always just one moment away, one encounter away from having our lives directed in an entirely new way. And the beautiful thing is that Jesus seeks us out for this encounter. Jesus encounters the Samaritan woman despite the fact that she's a Samaritan, that she's a woman, and that she's an outcast. He looks for the encounter. Paul tells us in the second reading today, the love of God has been poured into our hearts. Christ died for the ungodly, us. He says it's hard enough to die for a just or a good person, but how much harder it is to die for the sinful. God proves his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Even in our sin, Christ seeks to encounter us. He seeks to invite us into a new relationship, seeks to open up our lives, seeks to provide living water. So in this last 4 weeks of Lent, let us recommit ourselves to our Lenten practices, to deepen our encounter with God, and to encounter God wherever we may find him. In so doing, we can answer the question, is God in our midst or not?